The dust had not settled on Thomas Hawkins's grave before the first neighbor came to offer his condolences and his opinion that Jennie ought to sell the land. She did not sell the land. That was the autumn of 1873, out in the dry hills of Crockett County, Texas, where the wind came howling off the plateau like it had a grievance with everything standing upright. Jennie Hawkins was 31 years old when her husband died of a fever that started in a cut on his hand and spread through him like fire through dry grass. She stood at his grave with her two sons beside her, Cole, who was 9, and Danny, who was 6, and she held both their hands and did not cry until they were inside the house with the door shut, and then she cried for exactly 1 hour and stopped. She could not afford more than that. Thomas had been a good man, a quiet man who worked hard and laughed at small things and loved his boys with a steadiness that never needed announcing. He had not been a prosperous man, but he had been a present one, and his absence was a hole in the middle of everything that Jennie had to walk around every single day of every single week that followed. The farm was modest. 24 cattle, a milk cow named Bess, a mule called Sherman, 3 chickens that laid with sullen irregularity, and 40 acres of land that had been generous in good years and punishing in bad ones. The year after Thomas died was a bad one. The drought came first. It came the way droughts always did in that country, not all at once but gradually, the way a fire burns down from the top of a candle, slow and inevitable and leaving nothing behind it. The grass went yellow in May, which was not unusual. It went brown in June, which was cause for concern. By July, it had simply stopped existing in any meaningful way, and the cattle began to lose flesh off their bones in a manner that kept Jennie awake at night doing calculations she already knew the answers to. She sold 6 of the cattle before they wasted any further. She used the money to buy grain to keep the others alive. She traded 2 afternoons a week of domestic labor at the Beaumont Ranch 8 miles east in exchange for the use of their working well, hauling water back to her own property in barrels loaded onto Sherman the mule. She shot a deer in September, which was difficult because she had never been a natural shot the way Thomas had been, and she spent 3 shells and walked 2 miles before she brought it down, and she butchered it herself and salted the meat, and it fed her and the boys for 6 weeks. Cole, who was 10 by then, took on a seriousness that sat strange on a child's face, but was not something Jennie could afford to argue with. He mucked stalls and mended fence and carried water without being asked. Danny, who was 7, did what he was told with the cheerful compliance of a child who does not yet fully understand what is at stake, and Jennie was grateful for both of these things. The raids came in the winter. There had been trouble with outlaws working the area between Crockett County and the next, a loose band of men who moved through isolated homesteads and took what they wanted. The Beaumont Ranch lost a horse and 2 weeks of stores. The Fetterman place 6 miles west was ransacked entirely while the family was at church. When they came to Jennie's place, it was on a Tuesday night in February, cold enough that their breath showed in the air, and there were 3 of them on horseback. She heard them from inside, and she put Cole and Danny in the root cellar under the kitchen floor, and she stood in the main room with Thomas's old shotgun loaded and the lamp turned low. They broke the door rather than knocking, which told her everything she needed to know about the nature of the conversation. She shot the door itself as they came through it. High so the pellets spread wide and harmless, but the noise and the smoke filled the doorway, and she cocked the second barrel and said in a voice she did not recognize as her own that she had another barrel and a pistol behind it, and she would use both before she ran. They left. She did not know if they believed her about the pistol, which she did not have, or if the shotgun blast had frightened them more than she expected, or if they simply decided the trouble was not worth whatever meager reward her farm would offer. She retrieved her boys from the root cellar and sat on the floor with them in the lamplight and held them until they stopped shaking. Then she made them hot cornmeal porridge and put them to bed and sat alone at the kitchen table for a very long time. By the following spring she had rebuilt the door herself with lumber from a fallen section of the barn wall. She had kept 15 cattle alive through the winter. She had planted her garden early, accepting the risk of a late frost because she needed the growing season every bit she could get. She had not asked anyone for anything except what she could fairly trade for it. This was the life Jennie Hawkins had made for herself and her sons in the years following Thomas's death. It was not a comfortable life or a pretty one, but it was hers, built board by board and day by day with her own 2 hands, and she carried it with a dignity that was not pride exactly, but something quieter and deeper than pride. She had not thought about marrying again. She had not had time to think about it, first of all. And second, the men who had expressed interest in the season or 2 following Thomas's death had expressed it in a manner that made plain they were more interested in the land than in its keeper, and she had no patience for that sort of arithmetic dressed up in Sunday manners. She was not a desperate woman. She was a tired woman, which is a different thing entirely, and she knew the difference. Bernard McCrae came to Crockett County in the spring of 1875. He came from east of Abilene, where he had worked cattle drives since he was 19 years old, and he was 34 now, and carrying the years of that work in his shoulders and his hands and the way he moved, which was unhurried and deliberate and quiet in the way that men who have spent long stretches of time in open country tend to be quiet. He had saved his wages carefully, which was unusual for a drover, most of whom spent what they earned in the first saloon town they reached after a drive and started the next season as poor as they began it. Bernard had not done that. He had wanted land of his own, and now he had enough to get started. He came to the Beaumont Ranch first, because Will Beaumont had a reputation as a fair man who knew the county and could point a newcomer in useful directions. Will set him up in the bunkhouse for the spring planting season in exchange for labor, which was a good arrangement for both of them, and it was through Will that Bernard first heard about Jennie Hawkins. "Remarkable woman," Will said one evening on the porch after supper, not to Bernard specifically, but to the general company of himself and his wife Martha and the 2 hands who had stayed on through the slow season. "Lost her husband 2 years back, and has kept that place going by herself. I offered to send men over to help fence that north pasture last fall, and she said no thank you, she had it managed." "Did she have it managed?" Bernard asked. Will laughed. "She did. I went by 2 weeks later, and that fence was as straight as anything I've got." Bernard filed this information away without attaching any particular significance to it. He was thinking about land, about the 40 acres north of the Beaumont property that Will had said might be available from the Hendry estate if a man moved on it quickly. He was thinking about cattle prices and what a man could realistically build in 5 years on modest capital in that part of Texas. He was not thinking about Jennie Hawkins. He met her in town, in Sandoval, which was the nearest settlement of any consequence, on a Saturday in April when he had ridden in with Will to collect supplies and register his interest in the Hendry land with the county office. She was at the general store with her younger boy, Danny, who was 8 now and had Thomas's coloring, dark-haired and brown-eyed and serious in a way that made him seem older than he was. Bernard noticed her first because she was arguing politely, but with absolute certainty with the man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow named Grout, who ran the store with the cheerful conviction that credit terms were something he invented fresh each week. "That is not what we agreed upon in March, Mr. Grout," she was saying. "We agreed on 30 days at the standard rate. This figure here represents 60 days at a rate I did not consent to. Mrs. Hawkins, I assure you, the standard rate has adjusted with the season," Grout said. "Then I would need to have been informed of that adjustment before I agreed to the terms, not after," she said. "The number I agreed to is the number I will pay. I have it written down." She produced a small notebook from her coat pocket and opened it to a page and set it on the counter with a precision that was not aggressive but allowed for no argument whatsoever. Grout looked at the notebook. He looked at Jennie. He adjusted the figure. Bernard, who had been waiting his turn with a quiet patience born of long practice, found himself suppressing a smile. Danny looked up at him from beside his mother with the frank assessment that children apply to strangers, and Bernard nodded at him, and Danny nodded back with great seriousness. "You need anything?" Jennie asked, apparently becoming aware that she was between Bernard and the counter. "No rush," Bernard said. "You were here first." She gave him a look that was not unfriendly, but was measuring in the way that people who have learned to be careful measure things. Then she paid her settled bill, gathered her supplies into a canvas bag, and took Danny by the hand and left the store. Bernard completed his own business. He did not think about her for the rest of the day, or if he did not acknowledge it to himself. He saw her again 3 weeks later, on the road between Sandoval and the Beaumont property, where she was walking beside Sherman the mule, who was loaded with supplies and moving with the philosophical slowness that characterized all of Sherman's movements. Bernard was riding back from the county office, where the Hendry land matter had progressed to the point of requiring a second visit, and he slowed his horse automatically when he came up alongside her. "Your horse is slow," he observed, then realized immediately that Sherman was a mule and that this was not a particularly intelligent opening remark. "He is a mule," she said without breaking stride. "He is not in competition with anything." "Fair point," Bernard said. He matched his horse's pace to Sherman's and rode alongside her in silence for a moment. The road ran between dry hills covered in scrub cedar, and the afternoon light was coming down at an angle that turned everything a warm amber. "How far are you headed?" "My property is another 4 miles, she said. "That is a long walk." "I have done longer." He rode beside her in silence for another few minutes, long enough that declining to offer help would have become pointed and odd. "I could tie your mule to my horse and you could ride," he said. "My horse is not fast, but he is willing." She glanced at him. "I do not know you," she said. "Bernard McCrae," he said. "I am working the Beaumont place for the season. I heard of you from Will Beaumont." "What did you hear?" "That you kept a difficult property running by yourself and did it well." Something shifted very slightly in her expression, not softened exactly, but opened a fraction, the way a door opens just enough to admit light without committing to being fully open. "Jennie Hawkins," she said, "and I will walk, but I appreciate the offer." He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and rode on. He thought about her that evening. He sat on the bunkhouse steps in the cooling air and thought about the way she had stood at that store counter, and the straight line of her back as she walked that road, and the way she had said simply, and without apology, that she would walk. And he thought that there was something in the architecture of that woman that he had not encountered before in his particular experience of people. He did not act on this thought. He was not a man who rushed at things. May came on with more generosity than the previous 2 years, the rains arriving on something approaching schedule, and the grass coming up green and thick in the lower pastures. Bernard worked the Beaumont land during the days and spent his evenings reading or mending equipment or sitting quietly, which was a thing he was good at. The Hendry land purchase was progressing. The price was being negotiated, and he thought about it with the focused pleasure of a man who can see something he has wanted for a long time coming gradually within reach. He saw Jennie Hawkins at the church in Sandoval on the second Sunday of May, which was the first time he had attended services since arriving, as he was not deeply religious but found church useful for the social infrastructure it provided in small communities. She sat 3 rows ahead of him with her 2 boys, Cole on her right and Danny on her left, both of them in shirts that had clearly been laundered and pressed with great care. Cole was 12 now, and had the look of a boy approaching the threshold of becoming something else, still thin but with a new length in his limbs and a jaw that was squaring out. Danny sat with his legs dangling off the pew and watched the preacher with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in the material. After the service, there was the general milling about that happened in the churchyard, while people exchanged news and invitations and complaints about the county administration, and Bernard found himself standing near enough to Jennie to say good morning, which he did. "Mr. McCrae," she said, remembering the name, which pleased him more than he expected. "Your boys?" he asked, nodding toward Cole and Danny, who were chasing each other around the old oak at the edge of the churchyard in the immediate reversal of Sunday solemnity that children accomplish the moment adult supervision relaxes. "Cole and Danny," she said. "Cole is 12. Danny is 8. Good ages," he said. "They are," she agreed. She was watching them with an expression that was the most unguarded thing he had seen on her face, something warm and full and undefended. Then she looked back at him and the guardedness returned, not cold but careful. "How are you finding Crockett County?" "I like it," he said honestly. "I'm trying to acquire the Hendry land north of the Beaumont property." "That is good land," she said, with the authority of someone who knew the landscape. "Good water on the east side if you dig a well in the right place. Thomas, my husband, knew old Mr. Hendry and said the grass on that north rise stayed green 2 weeks longer in a drought than anywhere else around it." "That is useful information," Bernard said. "I offer it freely," she said, and there was the smallest hint of warmth in it, not quite a smile but in the neighborhood of one. Cole came running back from the oak tree with a scraped elbow, and the information that Danny had said something unfair. And Jennie turned her full attention to the logistics of this crisis, with an efficiency that was something between admirable and funny, producing a handkerchief for the elbow, and asking Cole a series of 3 quiet questions that apparently resolved the matter of Danny's statement to everyone's satisfaction. And Cole went back to the tree, and Jennie turned back to Bernard as though the interruption had not occurred. "You have good management," Bernard said. "I have practice," she said. They talked for another 10 minutes, which was longer than either of them had apparently planned, ranging through topics including the rain situation and the price of beef, and a blight that had affected some of the grain crops east of the county line. And Bernard noticed that she spoke about these things with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about them because their livelihood depended on the answers. She was not performing knowledge. She simply had it. He rode home thinking about her again, and this time he acknowledged to himself that he was doing it. He began to find reasons to pass by the eastern road, which went by the boundary of her property. He was not dishonest with himself about this. He noticed the fence she had repaired, which was good work, clean and tight. He noticed the garden that was already coming in along the south side of the house, visible from the road. He noticed the way the house itself had a quality of maintenance about it that spoke of consistent attention, that there was always something mended and something freshly whitewashed, and the yard kept free of the debris that accumulated on abandoned-looking properties. He stopped one afternoon in late May because Sherman, the mule, was standing in the middle of the road looking philosophical about a gate that had clearly come loose from its post, and the gate was now swinging freely in the afternoon breeze. And without thinking about it very much, Bernard dismounted and examined the gate, and found that the hinge pin had sheared, which was a simple fix with the right piece of iron. And he happened to have a suitable piece in his saddlebag, because he had been mending his own equipment that morning and had not emptied the bag. He was working on the hinge when Jennie came out of the house. She stopped on the porch and looked at him for a moment. He was aware of being observed and kept working. "Mr. McCrae," she said. "The pin sheared," he said. Sherman was looking at it like he was considering whether to go anywhere. "Sherman considers everything thoroughly," she said. She came down the porch steps and crossed the yard to the gate and watched him work. "You did not have to do that." "I was on the road," he said. "It would have been strange to ride past a gate with a sheared hinge." "Most people manage it," she said. He finished the repair and tested the gate, which swung smoothly and latched clean. He put his tools away, and Sherman walked through the gate with the air of an animal who had been waiting for this outcome all along. "Thank you," Jennie said. It was simply said, not effusive, but genuine. "It was nothing," he said. "I know the difference between nothing and something," she said. He looked at her, standing there in the afternoon light with her work dress and her dark hair and the absolute directness of her eyes, and he thought that he had probably never in his life encountered anyone who knew more precisely what the difference was between nothing and something. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, "I wonder if it would be appropriate for me to call on you, not for any particular reason, just to talk." She was quiet for a moment. He appreciated that she was quiet. She was not performing deliberation or being coy. She was actually thinking about it. "You may call on Sunday afternoons," she said. "After 2 o'clock. "Thank you," he said. He rode home with a feeling in his chest that he recognized distantly as the beginning of something significant. He called on the first Sunday in June at 2 o'clock, arriving with a jar of molasses he had bought in Sandoval because he could not arrive empty-handed and did not know her well enough yet to know what she would want. Cole answered the door and looked at the molasses jar, and then at Bernard, and then called for his mother with the flat efficiency of a boy who has learned to be the man of the house before his time. Jennie had made coffee, which she poured into 2 ceramic mugs without asking whether he wanted any, apparently operating on the reasonable assumption that anyone who rode 8 miles on a Sunday afternoon in the Texas heat would want coffee. They sat on the porch because the day was fine, Cole and Danny visible at the far end of the yard where they were conducting some project involving sticks and an arrangement of rocks that had the intensity of something important. They talked for 2 hours. About the land, about cattle, about the county and the people in it, about the winter that had passed and the summer that was coming. Bernard told her about the cattle drives, about the years on the Kishom Trail and what the country looked like coming up through Indian Territory, about the towns along the way and the men he had worked with. He did not embellish or dramatize. He just talked, which was unusual for him. He was not generally a talking man. She told him about growing up in Fredericksburg, further east and north, in the German immigrant community that had built a careful civilization in the Texas hills. Her mother had been German, her father an English-American farmer, and she had grown up with both languages and both sensibilities, the German precision and the frontier pragmatism, and it had made her, she said without self-consciousness, difficult to fool and hard to discourage. "Thomas used to say I was the stubbornest woman in 3 counties, she said. "Will Beaumont says you are the most capable woman in 2 counties, Bernard said. "Will Beaumont is generous, she said, but not wrong." He laughed, which surprised him. It was an actual laugh, not a polite one. She smiled at the sound of it just briefly, like sunlight coming through a cloud briefly and then going again. He called again the following Sunday, and the one after that. By the 4th Sunday of June, it had become a fixture of both their weeks, something they arranged around without discussing that they were arranging around it. Jennie began to have something on the porch table when he arrived, sometimes coffee, sometimes lemonade made with preserved citrus she got from Sandoval, once a slice of dried apple cake that she set in front of him without ceremony, and that was one of the best things he had ever eaten in his life, though he said so with measured restraint, because she had the air of someone who would be suspicious of excessive compliments. Cole warmed to him gradually, the way a careful child warms to someone new, first toleration, then observation, then occasional inclusion. He showed Bernard the fence repair he had done on the south pasture one Sunday afternoon, walking Bernard along the line with the proprietary pride of someone who wants their work recognized without asking for recognition directly. Bernard examined the fence with genuine attention and said it was solid work, and asked one question about the post spacing that was a real question, not a flattering one, and Cole answered it with real information, and they looked at each other with the mutual respect of people who are both taking the conversation seriously. Danny was easier. Danny had no defenses to speak of and decided within the first 2 Sundays that Bernard was acceptable, and demonstrated this by asking Bernard approximately 47 questions about cattle drives over the course of several visits, including what the cows ate, and what the men ate, and whether anyone had ever been stepped on, and whether there were any bears, and what happened if a horse refused to cross a river. Bernard answered all of them with the same unhurried honesty, and Danny filed the information away with great satisfaction. It was the 5th Sunday in June, the last one in the month, when Bernard realized that what he felt was not admiration in the general sense, but something more specific and more personal, something that had to do with the exact way Jennie looked when she was listening, the absolute attention she gave to things, and the way she had told him something the previous Sunday about the night the raiders came. Not seeking sympathy, but simply telling him, because they had reached the point where not telling him would have been a strange omission, and the steadiness with which she told it, the composed account of standing in that doorway with the shotgun and the boys in the root cellar, had done something to the inside of his chest that he could not name with any precision, but that he understood was not casual. He was 34 years old and had been in love exactly once before, a young woman in Abilene named Catherine who had married a banker's son in the spring of 1868, when Bernard was still a drover without prospects, which was a fair decision on her part, and one he did not hold against her. He had thought at the time that it had cured him of the inclination, but sitting on Jennie Hawkins's porch in the last afternoon light of June with the sound of her boys in the yard and the smell of the cedar hills coming in on the evening breeze, he understood that it had not cured him of anything. It had only deferred the matter. He did not say anything about this. He was not ready to say anything about it, and more importantly, he was not sure she was ready to hear it, and getting the timing wrong on something like this seemed to him a serious error. July brought the heat, and with it a problem with the Hawkins cattle, a respiratory illness that moved through 3 of the animals in the first week of the month with a speed that was alarming. Jennie recognized it from the previous year's accounts she had read in a farming almanac, and isolated the 3 affected animals immediately, which almost certainly saved the rest of the herd from infection. She sent Cole to the Beaumont Ranch with a message for Will asking about a veterinarian, and Will sent back word that the nearest man with the right experience was 40 miles south in a town called Myra, which was too far to be practical in the acute phase. Bernard heard about this through Will on a Monday morning and rode out to Jennie's property without being asked. He had some experience with cattle illness from his driving years, and knew a treatment approach that, while not guaranteed, had worked reasonably well in similar situations he had seen on the trail. She was in the isolation pen when he arrived, not fluttering around the animals helplessly, but systematically doing exactly what the situation called for, keeping the sick animals watered and monitored and away from the healthy ones. She looked up when she heard him, and for a fraction of a second, he saw relief move across her face before the usual composure came back. "I know a treatment," he said, "from driving years if you want the help." "Tell me what you know," she said. He told her, and she listened the way she listened to everything completely. They worked together for the rest of that day and the next, and by Wednesday the worst of the 3 animals had turned a corner, and by the following Monday all 3 were recovering. They lost none of the herd. It was on the Wednesday evening, standing at the fence of the recovery pen in the late light, both of them tired in the particular satisfying way that comes from hard work with a good outcome, that Jennie said without any particular setup, "I am glad you came." It was a simple statement. But from Jennie Hawkins, who did not say things she did not mean and did not say things that were merely polite when she meant something else, it was not a small thing. "So am I," Bernard said. They stood in silence for a while, which was comfortable in the way that silence is comfortable between people who have reached a certain level of ease with each other. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked. "Cole and Danny would like it." He stayed for supper. It was cornbread and beans with the last of some salt pork she had, not a grand meal, but it was eaten at a table with 2 boys who argued companionably about something that had happened at the swimming hole that afternoon and corrected each other's versions of events with energy and precision. And Jennie sat at the head of the table and moderated when necessary and laughed twice, actually laughed, with her whole face, which was something Bernard had not seen before, and which settled into him like a stone settling into still water, leaving the surface changed. He rode home in the dark and told himself very firmly that he was not going to say anything prematurely. He kept this resolve for 3 more weeks. It was the heat of August that ended his patience, or not the heat itself, but an afternoon in the middle of the month when he had ridden over for the Sunday call, and they were sitting on the porch, and she was telling him about a problem she was calculating, whether the profit from selling 4 of the cattle at current prices would outweigh the carrying cost of keeping them through a second potentially dry winter. And as she laid out the calculation with her characteristic precision, showing him the numbers she had written in the small notebook she always had in her pocket, he thought about all of it, the shotgun and the root cellar and the drought and the raiders and the fence she had built, straight as anything, and the cattle she had saved and the boys she had kept fed and clothed and alive and in school. And he thought about the specific quality of her face in the lamplight and the way she said things without ornament and the laugh he had heard at supper. And he said, more abruptly than he intended, "Mrs. Hawkins." She looked up from the notebook. "Jennie," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name, and they both registered it. "I would like to speak plainly." "You generally do," she said. "I would like to speak plainly about something that may require more plain speaking than I have done before," he said. She waited. She was good at waiting. "I have been calling on you for 2 months," he said. "And I think you know that I am not calling because I want to discuss cattle prices and fence repair, though I am happy to discuss those things. I am calling because I find you to be the most genuine and capable and interesting person I have encountered in my life, and because every Sunday I leave your porch with the feeling that the week has been building toward those 2 hours and everything after is recovering from them. And I think I owe you the honesty of saying that out loud so you can tell me what you think about it." Jennie looked at him for a long moment. "That is plain speaking," she said. "I said it would be." The afternoon was very quiet. A mockingbird was doing something complicated in the cedar tree by the fence. Cole and Danny were somewhere out of sight behind the house, and the sounds of whatever they were doing were distant and peaceful. "Bernard," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. He felt it like a hand pressed flat against his sternum. "I am a woman with 2 children and 40 acres and 15 cattle and a mule who has the personality of a retired senator. I am not an easy prospect." "I did not say you were easy," he said. "I said you were genuine and capable and interesting. None of those things require easy." Something moved in her face. Not the brief lamp-through-cloud smile, but something slower and deeper. "My boys are not an afterthought," she said. "They are not something to be managed or tolerated. They are the center of everything I do." "I know that," he said. "I have spent 2 months watching you, Jennie. I understand exactly what I am describing." She looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap with their characteristic stillness. The hands of a woman who had done hard work and made it look like nothing because she never made a production of any of it. "I am not ready for anything hasty," she said. "I am not a hasty man," he said. "You have been here less than 4 months," she said. "I plan to stay considerably longer," he said. "The Hendry land is mine as of last week. The deed was signed on Thursday." She looked up. "You bought the Hendry land." "I did." "That is good land," she said again, the same words she had used in the churchyard in May, but with a different weight now, an awareness of what it meant that he was not a man who was passing through. "I am aware," he said. She was quiet again. The mockingbird continued its complicated business in the cedar. "I would like to continue calling on you," he said, "on the same terms as before, and I would like you to know why I am doing it, which I have now told you. And I would like to give you all the time you need to form your own thoughts about it." Jennie Hawkins looked at Bernard McCrae in the August afternoon, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, and then she said, with a care and an honesty that matched his exactly, "I think I have already begun to form them." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. But it was the door opening a little further, enough to step through if a person was patient. He was patient. September was a revelation of a month. The first rain in the right time and the right amount. The grass greening up and the cattle putting flesh back on, and the garden giving Jennie the last of its season with a generosity that made her plant 3 times the preserved goods she had managed the previous year. The boys went back to the school in Sandoval, riding double on Sherman for the 4 miles because Cole was old enough now to manage the mule and Jennie needed the time at home. And the days had a rhythm and a fullness to them that she had not felt in 2 years. Bernard came on Sundays, and they had established between them without discussing it that these visits were something different from the early polite calls. He stayed for supper consistently now. He and Cole had taken to walking the property line together after supper while the light lasted, doing the kind of quiet inspection that men who care about land do together. And Cole had stopped watching Bernard with the guarded eyes of a child protecting something, and started watching him with a new expression that Jennie recognized as trust, which was not a thing Cole gave without careful consideration. Danny had long since adopted Bernard with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a child who has decided a thing and sees no reason to complicate it. He would appear at Bernard's elbow within moments of Bernard's arrival and begin a conversation that sometimes started in the middle of a topic from 2 Sundays prior, apparently expecting Bernard to have kept up, and Bernard did keep up, which made Danny deeply satisfied. On a Sunday in the middle of September, Bernard and Jennie sat on the porch after supper in the cooling dark and talked in a way they had not quite talked before, about things that were not practical or agricultural, about what they wanted, about what they believed, about the shape of a life as they understood it. Jennie said that what she wanted was very simple when you stripped away everything that had accumulated on top of it. She wanted her boys to be whole. She wanted her land to be stable. She wanted to stop waking up in the night with the particular cold arithmetic of worry, the mental tallying that was always going on somewhere behind everything else she did, and she wanted to wake up some morning and feel the weight of that arithmetic gone. Bernard listened to all of this with his whole attention. "And for yourself," he said, "what do you want for yourself, separate from all those obligations?" She was quiet for a moment. This was a question she did not often get. "I want to feel like I am known," she said finally. "Not managed or helped or directed, known. The way Thomas knew me, knew what I was actually thinking when I said something and knew when I needed quiet and when I didn't." She paused. "I had not thought I would want that again. I thought I had used up that particular capacity." "And now?" he asked. She looked at him in the dark, just the shapes of them there, the porch boards and the cedar smell and the vast starred sky of Texas above them. "And now I am uncertain," she said, "which is not the worst thing I have been." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and put his hand over hers, which were folded on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over under his and their fingers settled together, and they sat like that in the dark for a long time, which was more significant than any number of words would have been. October came, and with it a change in the quality of everything. The mornings were cool and sharp-smelling, the cedar hills going gold at the edges, the cattle fat and content. Jennie found herself thinking about Bernard during the week, not anxiously, but with the quiet comfort of someone thinking about something that is good and real. She thought about the way he had said she was the most genuine and capable and interesting person he had encountered in his life, and she turned it over and examined it the way you examine a stone to see if it is real, and it felt real every time she looked at it. He had begun helping with things at the farm, not intrusively or without invitation, but in the natural way that happens when 2 people are increasingly linked, showing up on a Thursday to help Cole fix a section of barn roof that had been worrying them, bringing a length of rope she had mentioned needing, pausing on a ride past to help move a boulder that Sherman had been giving a wide berth for 2 weeks. He never made these things into occasions. He just did them and moved on, and she appreciated exactly this quality of it, the absence of performance. She told him one October afternoon as they walked the north pasture together while the boys were in school and Sherman watched from the gate with his usual senatorial air that she had been thinking about what he said in August. "I have been thinking about it too," he said. "I know," she said. "I can tell." They walked for a while. The grass was dry but not the desperate brown of the drought, just the autumn brown that meant the season turning rather than defeat. "I am not a simple woman," she said. It was not a warning exactly, more of a full disclosure. "I have noticed," he said with the smallest note of warmth in it. "And I would not be simple to be married to," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped a step later and turned to face him. He looked at her with the straightforward attention that was his characteristic mode, the look that made people feel they were being seen accurately and without adjustment. "Jennie," he said, "I am going to be honest with you. I have been married to the idea of simple for a long time and it has produced nothing. I am not looking for simple, I am looking for real." She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the dry grass around them. "I think I might be in love with you," she said. It came out with the same matter-of-fact quality she brought to everything, not dressed up or cushioned, just stated, because she had thought about it carefully and it was true, and she was not in the habit of obscuring true things. Bernard stepped toward her and she did not step back, and he put both hands on her face. Gently, "The way you hold something you understand is valuable and fragile," and he said, "I know I am in love with you." She closed her eyes. He pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood there in the north pasture with the wind moving around them and the cattle watching with incurious bovine interest. And it was one of those moments that do not announce themselves as significant while they are happening, but that you understand later were the turning points around which everything else arranged itself. He kissed her, just briefly, careful and warm and without urgency, as if he had all the time in the world and knew it. She leaned into it. When they walked back to the house, their hands were not linked, but they walked close, closer than they had before, and it meant everything. Cole knew immediately. He came home from school that afternoon and looked at his mother's face, and then at Bernard, who was mending a bridle at the kitchen table, and he went very still in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat at the table and watched his mother with a careful attention that was not hostile but was evaluating. That evening after supper, Cole asked Bernard to help him with the evening chores. It was the first time he had asked directly rather than just accepting Bernard's presence at the tasks, and Bernard recognized it for what it was. In the barn, in the lamplight, Cole said, "You like my mother." "I do," Bernard said. "More than just calling on Sundays," Cole said. "Yes," Bernard said. Cole forked hay for a moment in silence. "My dad was a good man," he said. "I know he was," Bernard said. "I have heard nothing but good of him from people who knew him." "He taught me to fix fence and to read the sky for weather," Cole said. "He used to say that a man who could read the sky never got caught by surprise." "That is good advice," Bernard said. "He died anyway," Cole said, matter-of-factly, the way children sometimes say the most devastating things. "He did," Bernard said. "That is the hardest kind of truth." Cole leaned on the pitchfork and looked at Bernard with his father's eyes. Jennie had mentioned that once, that Cole had Thomas's eyes, steady and brown and difficult to look away from. "If you hurt her," Cole said, with the dignity of a 12-year-old who has had to grow up faster than 12-year-olds should, "I will find a way to make you regret it." Bernard did not smile, because this was not a moment for smiling. He looked Cole straight in those steady brown eyes and said, "That is exactly what I would want a son of mine to say in this situation, and I give you my word that I will not." They looked at each other. Then Cole picked up the pitchfork again and they finished the chores in companionable silence. And when they came back into the house, Cole told his mother that Bernard said the bay calf was developing well, which was true, and he sat down to his schoolwork with the air of someone who has conducted an important piece of business and is satisfied with the outcome. November arrived, and with it a clarity about everything. Bernard's land, the old Hendry property, was being made ready. He had built a rudimentary shelter on it, enough for the winter, and had moved his few belongings from the Beaumont bunkhouse, which was a small but decisive step. He had a plan for the land, modest and realistic, a starting herd of cattle and the gradual expansion that was possible if a man was careful and patient. But the plan that occupied his thoughts more often now was a different one. He came to the Hawkins property on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of November, not Sunday, which was unusual, and he sat with Jennie at the kitchen table with his hat on the table in front of him, and he was uncharacteristically direct even for him. "I have been thinking about what I want to say and how to say it," he said, "and I have decided that the how is not as important as the saying." She waited. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to be your husband and a presence in your boys' lives, and I want to build something on this land and mine that is bigger and more enduring than either of us can build separately. I know you have had to be everything for yourself and your boys for 2 years, and I know that changes a person in ways that do not undo themselves, and I am not asking you to give any of that up. I am asking you to let me stand next to it." Jennie was looking at him. Her hands were flat on the table. She was very still. "I have thought about this," she said. "I know you have," he said. "You think about everything." "I have thought about what it would mean for Cole and Danny," she said. "Yes," he said. "And what it would mean for me," she said. "Yes." "And whether the land and the work and all of it would make sense together," she said. "Yes," he said. "Does it?" "It does," she said. "That is the maddening part. Every calculation I do, it comes out the same." "What does it come out as?" She looked at him across the table, this steady, quiet man who had appeared in her life and stayed there and made no demands and kept every small promise he had made and seen her clearly from the beginning, who had sat with her dying cattle and eaten her simple suppers and taken her son's protective interrogation seriously and held her hand in the dark on the porch. "Yes," she said. He let out a slow breath. "I was going to ask you whether we should wait until spring," she said. "But yes," he said before she could finish the thought. She blinked. "You do not know what I was going to say. You were going to ask whether we should wait until spring or whether there was reason to do it sooner," he said. "And my answer is yes to whichever one of those is the real question." She looked at him for a moment and then she did something that surprised her more than it surprised him. She laughed, and it was not the brief lamp-through-cloud smile but the real laugh. The whole-face laugh he had heard once at the supper table, and it filled the kitchen like warmth. "You are a presumptuous man," she said. "I am an honest one," he said. "Which was what you said you wanted?" She sobered, not unhappily but into the seriousness of the moment. "I have a question," she said, "a real one, and I need you to hear it properly." He leaned forward slightly. "My boys," she said. "Not are you willing to have them around, I know you are, but truly, if you and I are married, Cole and Danny are your sons, not in name only, not as a courtesy. I need to know that you understand that and mean it, and that it is not something you are accepting as part of the bargain, but something you are choosing." It was the question she had been carrying for months without asking, the real question underneath all the other questions, the one that mattered more than anything else. He did not hesitate. He was already saying yes before she had finished the sentence, the yes coming out as she was still drawing the breath to complete her thought. And when she did complete it, they both understood that the answer had preceded the full question, because there had never been any doubt at all. "They are already mine in everything that matters," he said. "I am asking your permission to make it true in every other way." Jennie Hawkins looked at Bernard McCrae and understood that in her life of careful calculations and measured decisions, in her years of knowing exactly the difference between nothing and something, this was something. This was everything. "Then yes," she said again, "to all of it." He reached across the table and took her hand the way he had taken it on the porch in September, and she held his hand the way she had held it that night completely. And the kitchen was warm and the November wind was outside and everything felt, for the first time in 2 years, like enough. They told Cole and Danny that evening. Danny's response was immediate, enthusiastic, and primarily concerned with whether Bernard would bring his horse to live on the property, and when told that this was likely, Danny declared the arrangement wholly satisfactory and went back to his drawing. Cole was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet about important things, and then he said to Bernard, "You said you would not hurt her." "I did," Bernard said. "Good," Cole said. And he offered his hand, not the casual gesture of a child, but the deliberate handshake of someone making an agreement. Bernard shook it with the gravity it deserved. They were married in December, in the Sandoval church, on a day that was cold and bright with the particular blue sky clarity that Texas produces in winter, as if apologizing for the summer. Jennie wore her best dress, which was blue wool, and she had put her hair up in a way that she had not done since Thomas's funeral, and it made her look different. Not younger exactly, but more fully herself, as though she had been operating at reduced capacity and had turned something back on. Will and Martha Beaumont were there. The Sandoval schoolteacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Albrecht who had been kind to Cole and Danny, was there. A handful of the county's other residents who had been watching this development with the keen interest that small communities apply to romantic events were there, clustered in the pews with the satisfied air of people who feel their predictions have been validated. Cole walked his mother down the aisle, which had been his own idea, stated with quiet determination, and Danny walked on her other side holding her hand, and she looked at both of them before she looked at Bernard, standing at the front of the church in his good coat, which he had bought in Sandoval specifically for this occasion, and which fit him properly and made him look solid and real, which was exactly what he was. She looked at Bernard and everything simplified. The preacher said the words, which were the same words that had been said over generations of people making this particular promise in this particular country, and when Bernard said "I do," he said it without any hesitation whatsoever, the way he had been saying yes to her since before she finished asking. When she said "I do," her voice was steady and clear. He kissed her in front of the entire congregation, and there was no awkwardness in it, just the simple rightness of two people who have already acknowledged to themselves what they are to each other and are now saying it in the presence of witnesses. Danny clapped. Cole permitted himself a small smile that was, on his serious face, the equivalent of a standing ovation. The reception was at the Beaumont Ranch, where Martha had organized food with the thoroughness of someone who considers hospitality a serious art form. There was music, a fiddle player from the eastern part of the county, who played with the energetic disregard for pitch that characterized most amateur performances, but who was enthusiastic enough to compensate. And people danced on the broad wooden floor of the Beaumont barn, and Jennie danced with Bernard in the lamplight. And she thought that she had not danced since before Thomas got sick, and she had not known she missed it until she was doing it again. Bernard was not a natural dancer, but he was a determined one, and he held her with care and managed the steps with the focused concentration he brought to anything physical, and she found this so endearing that she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder to hide that she was smiling. "You are laughing at my dancing," he said. "I am appreciating it," she said, not lifting her face. "That is a kind way to say the same thing," he said. She lifted her face then and looked at him, and she said, "Bernard McCrae, you are the best thing that has happened to me in a very long time." He looked at her with his characteristic directness and said, "Jennie McCrae, you are the best thing that has happened to me in my entire life." She was still getting used to the name, Jennie McCrae. She turned it over in her mind as they danced and found that it sat easily, the way things that are right tend to sit, without the uncomfortable edge of wrongness. Winter settled over the county with the dry cold of that part of Texas, not the brutal wet cold of further north and east, but a persistent chill that kept close to the ground and frosted the grass in the mornings and made the evenings sharp and still. The merged household took some weeks to settle. Bernard moved his belongings from the shelter on the Hendry land, which they decided would be used for grazing but not yet for living, and he brought them to the Hawkins property, which they were calling McCrae property now in small gradual ways, the way a name changes on a place, not all at once but word by word. Cole adjusted to having Bernard in the house with the pragmatic adaptability of a child who has been taking care of things and can now redistribute some of that weight. There was an initial week of careful negotiation over small things, over space and routine, and the particular male territorial dynamics of a house that had been run by women and boys. And Bernard navigated this with such consistent patience and good humor that Cole's resistance dissolved before it really had a chance to form. Danny simply continued to be Danny, attaching himself to Bernard's routines with cheerful persistence and asking questions about everything. The property itself was the thing that occupied them through the winter, planning the spring, thinking about the Hendry land and what they could realistically add to the operation. Bernard's savings and the capital Jennie had preserved through 2 years of careful management were together enough to make something real if they were thoughtful about it. They were both thoughtful people. They planned well. January brought a cold snap that tested the cattle and the barn's condition both, and they spent 2 days running repairs on the structure together, Cole assisting with the energy of a boy who likes having his work counted as real. And they came through it with the herd intact and the barn better than it had been before, which was the right direction. In the evenings they sat by the fire, Jennie with her mending or her accounts, Bernard reading or working leather, the boys doing their schoolwork at the table, and it was so close to the thing she had thought she would never have again that sometimes she had to stop what she was doing and simply hold still for a moment to let herself feel it. Bernard noticed when she did this. He did not make a production of noticing, just met her eyes once across the room with a look that said, "I see you," and went back to what he was doing, which was the perfect response. February, the same month in which the raiders had come 2 years before, passed without incident. There were no raiders in the county that winter. The loose band that had been working the area had been pursued south by a determined county sheriff over the autumn and had fragmented and dispersed, which was satisfying information when it arrived. Jennie thought sometimes about standing in that doorway with the shotgun, about the year she had been holding everything together by herself, and she thought about it not with bitterness but with a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what it had taken. She had done what was required. She would do it again if she had to, but she was glad she did not have to. Spring came with the grasses and the hope that spring always brings in that country, the sense of the year beginning again, the possibilities opening out. They planted together. The garden expanded from what Jennie had managed alone. More ground turned with 2 people working it. The plans for adding to the vegetable store for the year more ambitious now that she had help. Bernard bought 6 more cattle in April, good stock from a reputable seller in the eastern part of the county, and added them to the Hawkins herd, which was now the McCrae herd, and watched them settle into the pasture with the satisfaction of a man seeing his vision materialize. Cole, who had turned 13 in February, was increasingly useful on the property, not in the diminished way of a child being put to adult work before his time, but in the genuine way of a young person growing into capability and taking pride in it. Bernard had begun teaching him to read cattle the way a drover reads them, the health signs and the behavioral patterns, and Cole absorbed this information with the same precision he brought to everything. Danny turned 9 in March and received a puppy from Bernard, which was a strategic masterstroke if Bernard was honest, because Danny's attachment, which was already substantial, became absolute, and the puppy, a mixed-breed animal of great energy and uncertain heritage, was named Sergeant by Danny with great seriousness, and proceeded to occupy approximately a third of Danny's conscious attention for the foreseeable future. It was in April that Jennie understood she was expecting a child. She was not surprised exactly, but she held the knowledge quietly for a few days before telling Bernard, turning it over, letting herself feel the full complex reality of it. She was 33 years old. She had had 2 children and knew what the process involved and what it asked of a woman. She was healthy and strong, and the circumstances were far better than they had been for Cole and Danny. She told Bernard on a Sunday evening after the boys were in bed, sitting by the fire, and she said it simply and directly, the way she said everything. He went very still for a moment, the way people go still when something lands that is too large to process immediately, and then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something open and undefended in a way that his face rarely was, and he got up from his chair and knelt beside hers and took both her hands and said, "Jennie." That was all he said for a moment, just her name. "I am healthy and there is no reason to be alarmed," she said practically. "I know," he said. "I am not alarmed, I am." He stopped. He was searching for the right word, which was unusual for him. "I do not have the right word for what I am." "Happy," she offered. "Completely," he said. "And afraid of being that happy. And grateful in a way I do not know how to express without sounding like a lesser version of what I mean." She looked at him kneeling there, this man who had come into her life and stood next to everything she was and made it stronger rather than trying to replace it, and she cupped his face in her hands, which was a thing she did not often do first, an initiative that was not usually hers, and she said, "You do not need better words. I understood you." He turned his face into her hand and pressed his lips to her palm, a gesture so genuine and unperformed that she felt it in her whole chest. "I will be here for all of it," he said. "Every part." "I know," she said. "That is why I told you." They told Cole and Danny the following week. Danny's response was to ask whether the baby would be a boy or a girl, and when told that this was not yet determinable, he issued a formal request for a brother, which he lodged with the air of someone filing a petition with the relevant authorities and expecting results. Cole smiled his quiet smile, and then did something he had not done since early childhood. He hugged his mother, a brief fierce hug that said more than 12-year-old boys generally allow themselves to say, and then he straightened up and told Bernard that he would help with the extra work, which was exactly what Bernard had expected him to say. Summer settled over the property warm and generous, and Jennie moved through it with the focused energy of a woman who knows from experience that the work does not pause for pregnancy, and who intends to stay ahead of it for as long as she reasonably can. Bernard, without making it a production, redistributed the heavier physical work onto himself and enlisted Cole's growing strength for the fence and barn maintenance, and he did this so naturally that Jennie did not have to navigate the complicated feelings of being helped more than she wanted, because it was done without announcement. This was the thing she had come to understand about Bernard McCrae. He was not a man who helped with an audience. He was not a man who waited for gratitude or for notice. He simply saw what was needed and did it and moved on, and this was so consistent and so genuine that she found herself loving him for it with a depth that surprised her even now, even having lived with him through a season. She told him this one July evening on the porch, the way she told him things directly, without much preamble. "I love you more than I expected to," she said. "I want you to know that. I came into this with a clear head and no illusions, and I thought I knew what to expect, and you have exceeded it." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the hills in the evening light. "I have been trying to be worthy of you every day," he said. "I do not always feel I am succeeding." "You are," she said, "more than you know." He looked at her, and the warm, steady thing in his eyes was the look she had come to know as the look that was specifically for her, the look that said, "I see you clearly and I choose you with full knowledge," and she understood that she gave him the same look back and that they both knew it. "Jennie," he said, "I want you to know that the question you asked me, the one about Cole and Danny," she waited. "I think about it sometimes," he said, "not because I am uncertain of the answer, but because it was the right question to ask and it deserved a better answer than I gave it." "You said yes before I finished asking it," she said. "I know," he said. "Because I already knew. I had known for weeks by then. But what I should have also told you is that those boys have given me something I did not expect, which is the experience of being trusted by children who have reason to be careful about trust." Cole shook my hand like a grown man. "Danny tells me every important thing that happens in his life. That is not nothing. That is not even something. That is everything." Jennie looked at him, and the thing she felt was too large and too complete to name as any single emotion. It was love in the full sense of the word, not just the first warm feeling of it, but the settled, solid, real thing that love becomes when it is built from honesty and time. "You are the right man," she said. "I want you to know that I know that." He reached over and found her hand in the dusk and held it, and they sat on the porch in the warm Texas dark with the child growing between them in the literal sense and everything they had built growing around them in every other sense. And it was exactly what both of them had wanted and neither had allowed themselves to fully believe in. October brought the harvest and the preparation for winter and the growth of Jennie's pregnancy into the visible and undeniable. And the life of the property continued in its rhythms, which were now their rhythms, hers and Bernard's and Cole's and Danny's, all of them moving through the days together with the particular efficiency of a household that has found its working arrangement. Bernard had hired a man named Garrett, a steady older fellow who had worked cattle all his life and wanted a permanent position on a property rather than the seasonal itinerant work he had been doing. And Garrett came on in the fall and proved himself useful and unobtrusive within the first week. And he was particularly good with Cole, treating the boy as a capable junior hand rather than a child to be managed, which Cole responded to with the dignity it deserved. The herd was now 22 cattle, the largest it had been on the property in its history. The Hendry land was providing excellent additional grazing, and the plan for the following spring included a modest additional purchase that would make the operation viable in a way that Jennie had only been able to imagine in her most optimistic calculations before Bernard arrived. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been 2 years ago, standing at that grave in the autumn wind, holding her son's hands and calculating how to keep everything from collapsing. She felt continuity with that woman, was proud of her in the way you can be proud of yourself when enough time has passed to see what you actually managed, but she did not want to be her anymore. She wanted to be this, the person she was now with all of it, the grief that had softened and the work that had become shared, and the man who sat across from her at the supper table every night. The baby came in December, almost exactly 1 year after the wedding, and he came into the world in the house where Bernard and Jennie had made their life with the determined efficiency of a child who does not intend to be any more trouble than necessary. He was a boy, which Danny greeted with the vindication of someone whose formal petition had been granted, and he was healthy and red-faced and had, for a brief confusing period, the look of an old man who has opinions, which is how most newborns look. They named him Thomas Bernard McCrae. This had been Jennie's idea, and when she told Bernard what she intended, he had looked at her with the particular expression she now recognized as the one that meant he was holding something large inside him and managing it carefully, and he had said, "That is a good name," in a voice that was somewhat unsteady. Cole heard the name and looked at his mother with his father's eyes and said nothing, but he pressed his lips together in a way that meant he was holding something in too, and then he said, "That is right," which coming from Cole was an absolute approval. Danny said Thomas was a good name but wished they had picked something more exciting like Captain, but allowed as how Thomas was acceptable. Jennie held her baby in the days following and felt something she had not expected, which was a particular kind of gratitude that was separate from all the other kinds she had felt in the past year. She was grateful to Bernard for the child in the obvious way, but she was also grateful in a more specific and surprising way, that she had been willing to try again, that she had not closed herself off from this possibility, that she had said yes when yes was the honest answer even though yes was the harder and more vulnerable thing. Bernard sat beside her in the evenings with Thomas in his arms, looking at the baby with the wondering attention of a man encountering something he has no precedent for. And Jennie watched him holding her child, their child, and thought that the man she had lost and the man she had found were different in every way, and that this was not a betrayal of either of them, but simply the truth of a life that continues to have room in it for love. Cole held his brother with the careful seriousness of a young man who understands fragility and respects it. Danny held his brother for approximately 45 seconds before declaring him boring, because he did not do anything yet, and returning to Sergeant the dog. But he checked on Thomas regularly with the proprietary concern of an older brother who has logged the claim. Christmas that year was the best any of them had had in recent memory. Martha Beaumont came with food and gifts, modest practical things in the way of the time and the place, fabric and tools, and a pair of knitted blankets for the baby. The schoolteacher, Mrs. Albrecht, came and stayed for a meal and declared Thomas to be a fine-looking child, which he was by then, having resolved from the opinion-holding old man phase into an actual pleasant-looking infant. Garrett ate with them and said little but smiled often, which was his characteristic mode. After everyone had gone, when the boys were in bed and Thomas was sleeping in the wooden cradle Bernard had made in the weeks before the birth, a cradle with good joined corners and smooth, planed sides that Jennie had run her hand over when she saw it and said simply, "This is beautiful." Jennie and Bernard sat by the dying fire in the quiet of the house. "1 year," she said. "1 year," he agreed. She looked at him across the firelight, this man she had said yes to before he finished asking, this man who had said yes to her before she finished the most important question she had. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "In October of 1873, when Thomas died," she said, "I stood at his grave and I made myself a promise. I promised that I would take care of Cole and Danny no matter what it took, and I promised that I would not fall apart, and I promised that I would not need anyone more than I could bear." She stopped. "And," he said quietly, "and I kept all 3, she said, "and I am glad I kept them because they kept us alive. But I want to tell you that needing you, which I do, is not the same as the kind of needing I was afraid of. It is not the kind that makes a person less. You have not made me less. You have made me more," he said, "every day." She got up from her chair and crossed the small distance between them and sat beside him on the bench where he was sitting, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they listened to the fire, and the still winter night, and somewhere in the house, Thomas made a small sound in his sleep, and they both heard it and both stilled for a moment, and then relaxed when silence returned. "He sounds like his brothers when they were small," Jennie said. "He looks like you," Bernard said. "He has your nose," she said. "He has a nose," Bernard said. "As yet it is too early to make claims." She laughed into his shoulder, the whole face laugh, and he pressed his lips to the top of her head. Spring came again to Crockett County in 1877, and with it everything that spring brings in that country, the greening and the hopeful calculations and the work of beginning another growing year. The McCrae property had become, in the 2 years since the wedding, a place of real solidity, not wealthy but stable, not easy but good, with the quality that comes to a property when people who know what they are doing and care about what they have built are tending it. The herd was 28 cattle. The Hendry land grazing was well established. Garrett had proven himself such an asset that Bernard had given him a permanent stake in the operation, a small percentage of the cattle proceeds that made him a genuine partner rather than a hired hand, and Garrett had responded to this with a ferocity of loyalty that was touching. Cole, at 14, was doing the work of a man, which Bernard allowed because Cole wanted it and was capable of it. But he also made sure Cole got to school and had time for the things that 14-year-olds should have time for, which Cole appreciated while simultaneously denying that he needed to be looked after. Danny was 10 and full of life, with Sergeant the dog at his heels through every waking hour, and a gift for arithmetic that Mrs. Albrecht declared was remarkable, and which Jennie recognized as something that had skipped over her own consistent competence into something more like brilliance. Thomas, at 4 months, had advanced from the opinion-holding old man phase through the pleasant infant phase, and was now in the phase of absolute magnetic personhood that certain babies arrive at, smiling at everything, and everyone with an unselective delight that made people feel specifically wonderful about themselves. On a morning in April, Jennie stood at the kitchen door in the early light, the baby on her hip, watching Bernard and Cole working the south fence line, the two of them moving along the posts with the synchronized ease of people who have worked together enough to know each other's habits, Cole handing the tools, Bernard working the joints, both of them talking in the way people talk when they are doing something with their hands, easy and unhurried. She thought about the question she had asked, the one that mattered most of all. She thought about the yes that had come back before she finished it. She thought about standing at Thomas's grave in 1873 with nothing but her sons and her land and her own determination. And she thought about standing here in 1877 with everything that had accumulated since then. Not just the cattle and the improved barn and the partnership with a good man, but the daily richness of being known and being loved, and not being alone in the particular way that widow alone is the loneliest version of alone. Bernard looked up from the fence and saw her standing in the doorway. He raised one hand in the simple greeting of a man who has spotted the thing that matters most and wants to acknowledge it. She raised her free hand back, the one not holding Thomas, and the baby on her hip grabbed at the air in the general direction of his father as if he too was waving. Cole looked up and saw them and grinned, a full unguarded grin that turned his serious face briefly into the face of a boy rather than the young man he was becoming, and Jennie felt the full weight of how much she had to be grateful for and let herself feel it completely, the way she had not let herself feel things completely for a very long time. The land was green. The cattle were fat. The fence was straight as anything. Her boys were safe and fed and loved. And the man coming up from the fence line in the morning light, stopping to say something to Cole that made Cole laugh, walking toward the house with the unhurried, deliberate way of a man who knows he is coming home, was hers. She went inside to make coffee, because Bernard would want coffee when he came in, and Thomas would need feeding, and Cole would want breakfast before the morning's work, and Danny would appear eventually from wherever he and Sargent had gotten to, and the day was beginning in the way all their days began now, with plenty and purpose and love. This was the life they had made. Not from ease or luck or simple fortune, but from the specific combination of a woman who would not be broken, and a man who recognized what that was worth, from the yes that had come before she finished asking, from the steadiness that had grown in the space between them through droughts and raids and grief and hope, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days that had followed. Jennie McCrae had kept her sons fed through drought and raid, had kept herself standing through the hardest years of her life, and had built something out of the ruins of what grief had taken from her. She had done it first alone and then together, and the together was better, was the best thing, was worth all of it. And Bernard McCrae had come to Crockett County looking for land, and had found something that made land look like the least part of the bargain. They had found each other in the precise way that people who are exactly right for each other do when they are finally in the same place at the same time, without drama, without misunderstanding, without anything except the slow and certain recognition of one genuine person by another. Thomas Bernard McCrae slept in his cradle in the back room, while his mother made coffee and his father came up from the south fence with the morning on his shoulders and his boys in the yard. And the year was turning green and full around them all, and it was, completely and without reservation, enough. More than enough. It was everything.